So today we move to chapter 4 in your book. That's the theory of market supply. Theory of supply and cost. So one thing that we have to know right off the bat here is we can compare the situation with the theory of market demand last week and theory of supply right now. The concept of cost plays the same role or a very similar role in the theory of supply that the concept of preference play in theory of demand. So demand is connected to preferences. So we've seen that the entire demand analysis was predicated on understanding human preferences and the strength of our preferences. In a similar way, the costs determine, or our understanding of market supply is predicated on good understanding of the concept of cost in economics. So that's the reason why we would analyze cost and supply alongside each other. So I'll give you once again just a basic overview of the concepts that are important here. So for the most part, we will be trying to distinguish between different types of costs and different definitions of costs, and we'll try to tie them all together in a certain sense. So the main thing that we will try to learn today is how to connect the notion of opportunity cost that we've already developed to the theory of production. Opportunity cost in the theory of production. So production costs. In which sense production costs are opportunity costs and how to understand that. So we have already some understanding that opportunity cost is the value of opportunity foregone when we make our choices. You come to class, so you have to sacrifice something else that you could have done in the same time. But it's not completely clear how to understand costs of producing things by using the same concept of foregone opportunity. So we're going to try to understand this, how this works. As a part of that, we are going to review different types or different concepts of cost. So opportunity cost is the first one. Sunk cost is one of the things that we will cover. Marginal cost, this is the key one. Marginal cost. You will now remember, you will notice very easily the analogy between the analysis of cost and marginal utility in theory of consumer goods. Remember, Robinson Crusoe sacks of corn and decreasing marginal value of the good as you increase the possession of, as you increase the stock of good that you possess. Something similar is going on in the theory of production. So we have marginal cost as opposed to marginal utility. So we're going to try and understand what is the marginal cost and how marginal cost is connected to price, market price. The next thing will be, once we understand the concept of marginal cost, how to connect that with the supply, the theory of supply. Marginal cost and supply. So I just want for you to better understand what is going on here. I just want to remind you of the way how we already defined the theory of demand. You remember what I told you, that you can directly derive the demand function, the demand relationship between the prices and quantities from the concept of marginal utility. Remember this. Price quantity. This is the demand curve. So lower the price, higher the quantity demanded. But one of the ways how we derive the demand curve, which is downward sloping like this, was to say, you know, the first unit of any good that you acquire is the most valuable. You would be ready to pay the highest price for it. Why? Why is that the case? Why would you pay the highest price for the first unit of some good that you acquire? You have 0, now you acquire 1. This one will be more valuable than the second one that you acquire. Why is that?
Your demand for it is greater than.
Yeah, your demand is greater, but why is that the case? Why you more strongly prefer the first unit to the second unit?
Marginal utility.
Yeah, marginal utility of the first unit is greater than the marginal utility of the second unit. Marginal utility is a satisfaction or utility that you derive from having one more unit. That's additional much. But why is the first unit more valuable to you by definition than the second unit? Remember Robinson Crusoe and 5 sacks of corn example that we used here. That he has 5 different uses for every single sack of corn. If he has just one, which of these 5 needs will be satisfied? Yeah, the first one, the most important one. So that's why the first unit of any good is most valuable, because it is used to satisfy the single most important need that you have on your value scale. The second unit that you acquire will serve to satisfy the second most important need, and so on down the line. So then you see that the demand curve could be directly derived. The first unit you will pay the price 1, which is a high price here, in order to acquire the first sack of corn. But then once you acquire the first one, for the second one you will pay a lower price. That's it. Then for the third one you pay an even lower price. And then the demand curve is just a collection of these points, or these pairs of quantities and prices that you're ready to pay for these quantities. So marginal utility, as you increase the stock of goods that you own, every next unit will be less valuable to you. So consequently, you will be in principle ready to pay less and less for every additional unit. That's, by the way, why they sell you sometimes in a store, buy the first pair of jeans for 15 bucks and then we're going to give you the second one for 5 for free. That doesn't mean actually that the first one costs $15 really, and the second one 0. It means only that you would probably pay 12 for the first one and 8 for the second one. They distribute the total average in a different way. So that's the reason for discounting, for the selling additional units at a lower price. Because people know that you value the first pair of jeans higher than the second one. Okay, so then we derive the demand curve, this curve that shows higher the price, lower the quantity demanded, and vice versa, directly from marginal utility, directly from how individuals make their decisions on the margin. There is nothing mysterious about that. And you will see, actually, this number 4 here, that supply of goods could be directly derived from the law of cost, from marginal cost, how people make decisions about marginal cost. There is the same relationship between supply and cost that there is as the relationship between demand and utility. Marginal cost and supply is the same type or very similar type of relationship as between demand and marginal utility. But we'll come to that in a moment. Okay, let's start with number one here, opportunity cost in production, the general theory. So what is the usual way how we see costs of production? Very often you can see I have to charge high price because my costs are high. The entrepreneurs very often justify higher prices by having to pay high costs. And indeed, that might be the case. The price of cars has to go up because one of the component parts, let's say steel, Trump administration introduced the steel tariffs. Steel is 20% more expensive. Cars have to be 2 or 3% more expensive because one of the components that they use has increased. So the costs influence the higher price. So that's the way how we usually talk about costs in general outside of the economic. So now, as you can see, this conflicts with our notion of opportunity cost that we learned about in the very first or second class. That says, what does it say? It says cost is subjective, number one, which means only the decision maker at the point of choice can know what is the real cost of his or her action. Number two, it's changing. It's not fixed. From one point in time to another, your costs of your action change, depending on your value scales, your preferences. Opportunity cost is the second most valued alternative for you. That can change. Whatever you consider to be the second most valued alternative at any one given point in time might change from one moment to another. And it's tied to the moment of choice. You can know what the real cost is only at the moment of choice. So now you see that this doesn't compute well, doesn't jive very well with our idea that cost is something that could be measured in monetary terms, something objective that we can have a bookkeeping or accounting record of. You know, the firms have my costs or cost items on my whatever accounting sheet. These two things do not sit well together. So we have to understand, we have to clarify the notion of productive cost. Is there any way to reconcile our subjective and choice-related nature of cost as opportunity cost and this notion of objectively measurable monetary cost that entrepreneurs pay? The following way is probably the best approach how to handle this issue. We need to analyze a little bit deeper. What do we mean when we say that the costs of some particular good increased? That one of the cost components increased in price. Why this happened? The easiest way of thinking about this is to conceive a model of an economy in which you have on the surface here human needs and wishes that are in principle unlimited. A variety of different needs that we want to satisfy. And down there, there is a reservoir of resources which is limited. You can then imagine that human needs and wants are like a suction pump that sucks the reserve, just like from an oil well or whatever, which is limited in quantity. There are dozens and hundreds and thousands of different suction pumps, all of which try to suck the resources out for their own particular purposes. There is a limited amount of oil in the well. So then, what determines which suction pump will attract or suck out the resources for its own? The strength of this suction pump. The strength of a particular need that could be satisfied by using a limited resource will determine who is going to get what. So now let's say this is suction pump like real estate or construction business. This is car business, car companies. This is tractor companies. And all of them are trying to acquire as much of steel as possible. And the quantity of steel down there in the reservoir is limited. So then the cost of production for any one of them is the value of steel in alternative uses. The value, the cost that they have to pay is determined by how much other people are ready to pay for it. How strong the competition for their particular resources. So what gives the value to steel, what gives the value to any resource is its utility for satisfying the final consumer needs. So in that sense, it's not the cost as objectively pre-existing category that determines the price of final consumer good. It's the other way around. It's the price of a final consumer good that consumers are ready to pay that will determine how high costs will be paid. Okay, so one example for you that I often like to use in these types of situations. California wine. They're relatively expensive and in high demand. And then the vineyards in Napa Valley vineyards are extremely expensive. To buy an acre of vineyards in Napa Valley is probably as expensive as to buy an acre of vineyards in Tuscany in Italy or in any other wine growing region. Now, if you look at the economic process from a standpoint of an individual entrepreneur, wine producer, you can say, oh yes, of course, the California wines have to be expensive because the Napa Valley vineyards are so expensive. They have to pay high prices for the materials and factors of production, for land that they use to grow grapes and so on. Of course, that's the way how we talk about economics. Whereas in reality, actually, what gives the Napa Valley vineyards high value is the value of final consumer demand for the good that you use the vineyard to produce, wine. Human preference for wine as a final product is what determines the value of everything else that participates in the process of producing wine. So now, why the price of Napa Valley vineyards is very high? Probably because you can use the same land for many other alternative purposes. Imagine for a moment that people discover that this land is even better for growing oranges. Or for growing something else that you can, let's say my favorite Serbian examples for apricots. Let's say it's even better to grow apricots and then to make a famous Balkan apricot brandy. If you ever try, if you have some Balkan friends, they will give you plum brandy called Slivovic or apricot brandy. These are national drinks in many countries in the Balkans. That's a first-rate, strong spirit. It's very strong. So then imagine some crazy Serbian or Croatian entrepreneur says, okay, I bet my bottom dollar that this land here that these suckers are using to produce wine is much better for making Slivovic. Americans want to pay even more for Slivovic or for apricot brandy than they pay for wine. What's going to happen to the price of land? It will skyrocket because now the consumer needs for apricot brandy or Serbian Slivovic will compete against the consumer need for California wine for the same limited pool of resources, for the same limited acreage of Napa Valley vineyards. So this is two strong suction pumps trying to suck out the same resource for their own purposes. So then the cost of producing wine in this particular case will be the opportunity foregone to produce apricot brandy. So then whoever wants to, whichever need is stronger, that guy will get the resource for his own purposes. Okay, so in the economic sense, you see that the opportunity cost applies to the theory of production as well. So the true cost of production is the value of goods that could have been produced by using the same resource. That's the cost. The cost is not something that is objectively known in advance. The cost is just the value of other things that could have been produced by using the same resource. You see, again, the same concept as in our consumer decision-making theory. What is the value of any decision that you make? The value of the cost of any decision is the second best alternative you have sacrificed in order to achieve whether X or Y or Z. So the same thing here. The cost at the level of society is the value of the next best alternative that society could have achieved by devoting resources to producing X instead of producing Y. So that's how we then reduce the talk about costs of production eventually to human preferences. So just as we here reduce the talk about market demand and purchases and consumer behavior to marginal utility, and marginal utility is determined by our preferences. In the same way, we can reduce the concept of cost to individual decisions, individual preferences. Resources have to be devoted to some purposes or to some productive enterprises. In doing so, because we know that all resources are limited, we have to sacrifice some production lines. Some things will not be produced or will be produced much less. Okay, so it's rarely either or, that you produce either apricot brandy or wine. It's rather marginal adjustment. It's one more unit, maybe a little bit more wine, a little bit less apricot, or vice versa. But at any rate, the ratio, how much of this will be produced as opposed to that, is determined eventually in the last instance, as Marxists would say, by consumer preferences. This pool of consumer vicious suction pump, quote unquote, resources will determine how resources will be allocated. So you get this basic idea of opportunity cost and productive cost. Productive costs are just opportunity costs of alternative productions. Any questions? That's fine. And then one more thing, when monetary cost is higher, that's just a reflection of the fact that there is a greater competition for the same limited resource. That's what higher cost means. So when you say, I have to increase price because my costs increased, what you're saying actually, precisely, directly, is that other consumers shifted their demand from my product to some other products that could use the same components, the same resources that I'm using. Okay? So then I have to charge you higher prices because there is not enough resources for me to produce a previously lower price. I have to bid up, I have to compete against other people for steel, for oil, for land, for labor, and so on. So eventually costs are determined by consumer preferences. That's the point. Another aspect of this is opportunity cost and costs of labor factors. Go ahead.
What like demand, like if there's a demand decrease for a certain item, the price of that item go down?
So demand increases,
Decreases.
demand decreases, and price goes down as well. Is that possible? Is it possible? Is that your question? What can explain this fact that the demand decreases and the price goes down? It's a very good question. Any ideas? It's very subtle idea. So we usually think that if price increases, the demand will go down, and if price decreases, the demand will go up. But there is one important limitation to that. That's called ceteris paribus, which means all other things being equal. So one of the situations that can happen, that can cause the price to go down and demand to go down at the same time, is if income goes down. So all other things being equal means that if your income is the same and your preferences do not change, then you will be buying less when the price increases, and you will be buying more when the price decreases. But if your preferences for something decline dramatically, you thought that you needed a second laptop, but for whatever reason you changed your preference and you realize you didn't need it. Even if they reduce the price 30%, you're not likely to buy it. So that's one of the situations in which lower price of a product can lead to lower demand, if the preferences of the people decline. Another issue would be, even if your preferences do not change, actually your income may go down. Then your demand for everything will go down because you have less money to go around. So it's theoretically possible, it's theoretically conceivable, it happens all the time. But in order to understand the relationships of demand and supply, we start from this position, this model simplification. Let's say, if everything else is the same, then higher price will lead to lower demand. That doesn't mean that everything else will be the same all the time, okay? But that's a principle that we have to develop. So many of the economic principles are such that you cannot empirically test the law of demand. That's a disturbing point here. Why? Because not everything else is the same all the time. It can very well happen that the price of something goes down and the quantity sold goes down. That doesn't mean that the law of demand is wrong. You see that? Doesn't mean if something like this situation happens that the law of demand is wrong. It only means that something else happened that counterbalanced the law of demand. Something else. The preferences changed, preferences weakened, or income decreased. That's why people are buying less, although the price is low. So that's a very good question. So one more thing that I wanted to say about opportunity cost at this point is that you can understand the wage determination by using the idea of opportunity cost. If you assume that there is a relatively free movement, that people can switch jobs, then what determines wages and opportunity cost of labor? So labor is just one resource as every other resource. Wages are compensation for using labor, for services of labor. So labor is a producer good, which means that labor is not something that you can enjoy directly as a consumer. Labor is valuable only insofar as it could serve as a means of producing something that you will then enjoy as a consumer. What determines? One question for you. Imagine the same person, let's say that a waitress in Bismarck, North Dakota, and let's say my hometown, Mladenovac, Serbia. It's a very poor country, 10 times lower per capita income. The same waitress, the same kind of, let's say, franchise, what's called the Starbucks cafe, or a similar cafe in Bismarck, North Dakota, Mladenovac, Serbia. Which waitress will have a higher wage? They perform the same work, essentially. And why? Whether a waitress in America will tend to have a higher wage or the other way around?
Well, the waitress in Bismarck.
In Bismarck, why?
Because the income is higher here
Okay. So people have higher income, people ready to spend more money. But why then employers do not pay waiters in business North Dakota much less? Why aren't they paid 2 times less than they are? Yeah, imagine that there is no minimum wage. Imagine any job that is paid much higher than minimum wage. The same principle applies.
No one want to work for that job.
Yeah. How can this be true? If she doesn't want to work, she can find another job. So see, this blackmail that an employee can exert on an employer is opportunity cost of labor. I will go elsewhere, the wages elsewhere are higher. Exactly for the reason that you said, people are wealthier than in America and in Serbia, they have a higher purchasing power, so the wages elsewhere are higher. So then the cafe owner has to match the wages that the waitress can achieve on a comparable job in some other line for whatever, Walmart or whatever. So that's the reason opportunity cost of work labor is much higher in America than in Serbia. That's why waitresses are paid much higher in Bismarck than in other places. That's the reason. So you see how opportunity cost influences wages as well. And the same applies to anything else. The same applies to any other resource, any other scarce good. There is one Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mises, wrote this interesting example illustrating this as Mises's butler, the famous illustration of this. Imagine a butler who did the same, the butler who served Gladstone and Disraeli in England in the early 19th century earns probably a fraction of income that waitresses in modern society. They perform the exact same type of job, and even the butler, the Disraelis or Gladstone, the British prime ministers in the 19th century, they actually serve more important people. Waitresses and waiters now serve us, like regular nobodies, commoners, so on, and they earn much more money. Why is that the case? Because the opportunity cost of butler's labor in the 19th century was much lower because society was much poorer back then. He could choose between some family factory or whatever, a farm, where the wages were relatively low, much lower than today, and every waiter or waitress can choose now from a much wider pool of available job opportunities. So you see then another concept here is how change in other aspects of our economic life, like the advance of technology and change in the corporate structure of the firms over time, increases the value of labor. The same type of labor that was much more valuable, much less productive before, now becomes much more productive. Without any responsibility on the side of the workers. Even if you didn't improve anything, you're the same butler or the same waitress as you would have been 100 years ago, because the situation in society changed due to other factors beyond your control. Your wages are infinitely higher. Okay, let's switch to the concept of sunk costs here. So sunk cost means that emphasizes one basic point, that the costs are paid, or the cost is paid at the moment of choice. Once something is done, it's done. Bygones are bygones. It's irrelevant for understanding the cost of an action, what you think or what you do or what you're gonna do today or tomorrow. The cost of an action is always in the past. So, cost of an action. Actions have costs, not things. Cost of an action. For example, in your book, you buy some piece of food for $5. You make this exchange because you value the food more than $5 that you paid. What is the cost of your action? The cost of your action is the second best alternative that you could have procured for $5. A cup of coffee or a newspaper or some different food or using it as a cheat in the pocket, in a game of poker, whatever else you had forgone in order to buy a lasagna. And then you discover that it's a very lousy lasagna, that you don't like it, that it's not good, that it doesn't taste well as well. And then you think, again, the clash between the economic concept of cost and how we think about cost in general, and how we talk at least about cost in everyday life. Oh, this cost me $5, and now I cannot eat it. So people are reluctant to throw away the lasagna because it cost me $5 to buy it. No. Once you made a choice, this is called sunk cost, past cost. It doesn't cost you anymore. You can destroy it now. It is costless. What has cost for you at this moment is an action that you might decide to undertake in the future. So sunk costs are costs of past actions, and they do not determine the value of present or future enjoyments. Once you pay the price of something, the cost is gone. The cost of a lasagna was a copy of the Wall Street Journal that you could have bought at that point, for example. You decided to buy a lasagna, now everything that you do with it is costless. Or it may not be costless. Let's say that you decide, you're thinking whether to throw it in a garbage can. What could be the cost of that action? It's not $5 that you paid for it. The true cost is actually the second best alternative use. Maybe you may think about giving it to your dog. And now the choice is between throwing it away and giving it to your dog. So the cost of new action is the utility foregone from some future actions. The utility of your dog versus your utility by throwing it away in protest because they sold you a crappy product. And now you decide what is better. So see, this is the concept of sunk cost. Cost that is already being paid. Serves to emphasize this prospective, future-oriented character of cost. Cost is always cost of something that is going to happen in the future. It's not the cost of something that already happened. Because it is tied to an act of choice. Whenever you make a decision, the cost is the cost of a future action. Any questions? Okay, let us move then to the concept of marginal cost. And its relationship to supply. So eventually what we want to do as a final goal is for us is to define market supply in the same way we define market demand last time around. by reducing it to individual preferences and to the concept of opportunity cost, as we already discussed. Now we're going to introduce the concept of marginal cost and to try and define it. So this opportunity cost is what counts in economic production. And as economic decision making is very often incremental, step by step, adding or subtracting a little bit more or less. And decisions about what to produce and how much to produce are always based on marginal cost of production. So if I increase my production of corn, let's say I'm a farmer who produces corn and soybeans at the same time, and I use my land for both purposes. And what is the cost? What is the marginal cost of producing corn? Okay. Is the value foregone? By producing a little bit less of soybeans. So remember this production possibilities frontier curve. That you have one good on the vertical axis, let's say bread and butter on the horizontal axis. And you can produce one certain quantity of butter and zero bread, or you can produce certain quantity of bread with zero butter, and then you can combine by sacrificing a little bit of one or the other, you can produce different combinations of that. And then you remember when you connect all of these dots representing potential trade-offs, potential combinations of these quantities, that you get this curve of production possibilities from here. So then you see, let's assume that you're producing all the bread and zero butter. Or what is the example in your book? Corn and, let me see, corn and soybeans. Soybeans and corn. And then what would be the marginal cost of corn, to simplify? I'm going to sacrifice my favorite examples of being bread and butter. I changed my preferences for pedagogical reasons. So you produce certain quantity. What is the maximum quantity of, let's say 14.4? They gave this example. 14.4 is the maximum number of units per harvest that you can produce if you use all of your land to produce soybeans, and 0 units of corn. And now let's say that you want to produce 1 unit of whatever metric cent or whatever unit, however you measure the unit of corn production. Let's say that you want to produce 1 unit of corn now. So what will be the marginal cost of producing 1 unit of corn? Can you tell me? What is the cost? What is the cost of producing anything in this type of situation? And you have to decide between 2 utilizations for the same resource. Go back to the suction pump. example. What is the cost of producing? Yeah, opportunity cost, the value of other thing that you go without. So now let's go a step further, and let's define marginal cost. So what is the marginal cost? What is the cost of producing the first unit of corn? This is the small difference that you have to sacrifice. The same drop from 14.5 to 13.5 units of soybeans production. You see, in order to increase your corn production from 0 to 1 unit, you have to sacrifice 1 unit to go from 14.5 to 13.5 units of soybeans. Is that the true opportunity cost? Is that the true marginal cost of the unit number 1? How an entrepreneur would calculate this marginal cost? Better to start producing corn. So quantity is not enough. You need to know something else in addition. It doesn't tell you much that for 1 unit of corn, you sacrifice 1 unit of soybeans. That cannot tell you whether it makes sense for you, whether the expected marginal benefit from producing 1 unit of corn is greater than expected marginal cost. So what is the precise measure of marginal cost in this particular case? It's not just the quantity of soybeans that you expect to sacrifice, but money. Think about money. It's a marginal revenue loss, which means how much money are you going to lose. So you need another piece of information here, that's the price of soybeans and corn. So if price of corn is 50 cents per unit, and the price of soybeans is $1 per unit, are you going to produce the first unit of corn? No, because you will be losing 50 cents per metric ton of corn. You would be losing 50 cents that you could have earned if you stuck to producing only soybeans. So then the revenue, how marginal cost is measured, is actually marginal revenue, which is quantity times price. That's marginal cost. Marginal revenue that you lose by producing something. By devoting, by switching your resources, your land, your labor, your hours of your machinery operation, or wages, time, labor hours of your employees, if you have employees. So, quantity of goods that you lose by switching those resources times price per unit of product. So that's it. Revenue that you lose equals marginal cost that you lose. And what is this? Go ahead.
Does that mean you can, does that mean marginal revenue is the same exact thing as marginal cost?
Yeah, marginal cost is actually marginal revenue lost.
Oh,
marginal revenue lost by deciding to shift resources from soybeans to corn. So marginal cost of producing 1 unit of corn is the marginal revenue lost by producing 1 unit less of soybeans. Money that you will be losing by shifting resources from making soybeans to making corn. So what is that's marginal cost of producing 1 unit of corn. What is the marginal benefit of producing 1 unit of corn? what you gain by going from 0 units of corn production to 1 unit of corn production. You got $0 revenue from corn before. Now what you got? If you produce 1 metric ton of corn and sell it, what's your marginal benefit? No, let's assume whatever. Let's forget about what is the exact price. Just in theoretical. What is the full measure of your marginal benefit? The measure of your marginal cost is the lost revenue, lost quantity of soybeans times price per unit of soybeans. That's marginal cost of 1 unit of corn production. What is the marginal benefit or gain from 1 unit of corn production? Price times quantity of corn. That's marginal revenue. We call that marginal revenue product. We can call it just marginal revenue. That's the dollar amount that you gain by producing certain quantity times price per unit. Whichever one is greater, you do that thing. Now, what is the problem here? The problem is that you cannot always be certain about these things. How much corn will you produce if you shift 2% of your resources from making soybeans to making corn? That might not be the exact mathematical calculation. That's why we need entrepreneurs. Or entrepreneurs are people who are good at guessing these types of things. Now, are you going to stop? Let's say for now that you earn more money, that your marginal revenue product of producing 1 unit of corn is far in excess of marginal revenue losses from reducing your production by 1 unit. Are you going to stop now? How long will you go in shifting resources from soybeans to corn? Can we say anything about it?
So there's a lot.
When you encounter the loss, when two of them equalize, when additional revenue from producing 1 more unit of corn roughly equals the revenue lost by producing 1 unit less of soybeans. Okay, so your decision as an entrepreneur how to allocate your scarce resources will be determined by this equilibrium between marginal costs and benefits of producing corn. Once the revenue is whatever close to equal, or we wouldn't say that they're exactly equal. You will stop shifting resources from soybeans production to corn production at the moment when you anticipate that increasing your production of corn by 1 additional unit will give you revenue which is lower than the losses from producing 1 unit of soybeans less. That's the equilibrium point. So you're at a certain point and you ask yourself whether to produce the 6th unit of corn. And then you think, if I do so, actually, the sacrifice is the loss of revenue by producing a little bit less of soybeans will be higher than the revenue gained by producing 1 more unit of corn. That's the point when you, again, everything is in the mind, in the head of the entrepreneur. This is not an objective piece of data that some bureaucrat or statistician or economist can discover. It's up to you. You decided at one point, say, I think that my marginal cost will be higher. I stop it. And that's the equilibrium then. You produce 5 units of corn and whatever, 7 units of soybeans, and you maximize your total revenue. So that's the final goal that you have is the total revenue, how much money you can make of your land and resources. Okay, this is reasonably clear. Also, marginal cost, marginal revenue. One more thing. Remember, analogy. Marginal utility is decreasing, it's diminishing, for the reasons that we already discussed. New things, new units of a certain good serve less and less important needs. There is a law of marginal cost. which says that the marginal costs are increasing. Marginal cost is increasing. That means the cost of sacrificing, the value of sacrificing the next unit of soybeans is higher than the previous one. So why is that the case? Why the cost, marginal cost of producing the first unit of corn is lower than the marginal cost of producing 10th unit? What do you think? This is a question for somebody who wants to earn a very, very good participation rate right away. Sure. Well, let's say the demand is fixed. Let's ignore demand. Compare it to marginal utility before. Compare it to Robinson Crusoe losing size. Can you repeat your question one more time? Why marginal cost is increasing? Marginal cost of producing corn is increasing.
Because so the first unit you produce is going to have the most important, will satisfy the most important needs, and then as you go down, it becomes less and less important. So it's giving that more.
Sort of, but in this particular case, you will be moving. Let's say that you decide to move resources from soybeans production to corn production. Which resources are you going to move first? Resources that are the least satisfactory, that are the least productive. You want to minimize your loss. And then as you go along, you will have to move the resources that are more and more essential for producing soybeans. And the cost of moving those resources is increasing. So that is shown in this curvy shape of the production possibilities from here. It's not a linear function. The opportunity cost is not linear. It's actually increasing. Because you will sacrifice first the least productive resources, and then as you deplete them for every additional unit of corn production, you will have to be sacrificing resources that are more and more productive. Okay. Let's say that labor is less important than capital. You will first start moving workers to corn production and all of that technical equipment and other stuff. That's the reason for the fact that the opportunity costs of production are increasing. The marginal costs of production are increasing. And at some point, they're equalized. The values of additional corn that is produced and the value of soybeans that is sacrificed. Okay, so now what can we conclude on the basis of this? So marginal cost is increasing. Now we can define the supply curve very easy. The supply curve or the supply function is a line that tells you how much people will produce depending on the costs. You have the same coordinating system, price and quantity here. What do you think? What is the shape of the supply curve? So the shape of the demand curve is like this, downward sloping. Supply curve, the other way around, upward sloping. Why is that the case? What do you think? Can we try and interpret this? Why the supply curve is upward slope.
The less of something you have, the more demand for it.
No, forget about demand. This is supply function. Why people produce more or less, and how much people produce at different prices. So actually, you see, in order for you, this is price one. This is quantity one. If you go ahead.
Is it because it's more expensive to produce a larger amount of product?
Exactly. Exactly. It's more expensive to produce the second and third and fourth unit than the first unit. So that if you want more stuff produced, you have to pay more. Higher the price, higher the quantity. The marginal costs are increasing, then in order for people to cover their costs of higher production, higher the volume of production, they need higher prices. So that means that there is a proportion when it comes to the supply function, unlike demand function, quantity demanded and price move in the same direction. But this is you just derive for us the supply function from the concept of marginal cost. Marginal cost is increasing. If you want the market to produce more, you need to pay a higher price to cover the higher marginal cost. That's the key connection between marginal cost and supply. Now, there is another way of looking at the whole problem that can shed additional light on this. And this is what happens when the price goes down on a given market. Let's not think about the supply curve as a supply curve that affects the entire market. It's not just the supply curve of an individual producer, but it's a supply curve for the whole market. Remember this distinction between individual demand curve and total market demand curve. Individual demand curve is how much certain good will be bought by a single person at any given price. Higher the price, lower quantity bought. Total market demand curve is when you add up all the quantities that all different people will buy at any given price. So something similar applies here. You can have an individual supply function for a firm, how much a single firm will produce, depending on the price, and that's determined by the cost function of a given firm, by the marginal cost. How much does it cost the firm to produce one more unit? But you can also draw a supply curve for the entire market. How many cars will be produced by the American industry, by the entire American industry, automobile industry, at a given price per type of car. Oh, we can say even better, some homogeneous product, like oil. So what happens actually when the price is lower on the market? Only the relatively low cost producers who can afford to make a certain quantity of goods at the cost lower than price. The market, they can afford to compete in the market. And as price increases, then the quantity supplied in the market will increase. Why? Why quantity of oil on the market will increase when the price of oil increases? Let's say that the price of oil increased because the demand for oil skyrocketed. And we can assume that as a consequence of this change in price, the quantity produced and sold will increase. Why that happens? Yeah, there is a high demand, but who is going to be producing this additional quantity of oil? Which firms? So two things will be happening. high efficiency firms with low cost, they will increase their production. Because their marginal costs will be going down because demand for other things will be going down vis-a-vis oil. So they can afford them to increase the quantity they produce. But also firms that could not afford to sell anything before because their costs are too high, they will enter the market. So the high cost firms will enter. So firms, let's say that this is $50 and this is 25. If the price is 25, only the firms whose per unit costs are lower than 25 will operate in the market. The firms whose costs are between 25 and 50 will be outside of the market because you cannot afford to sell at 25 and produce at cost of 37. If the price goes up to 50, all these firms, relatively less efficient firms, will be entering the market. So one example of this is the fracking boom in North Dakota in early 2000. When the fracking boom ended, 2007, 2008. Why did it end? Why fracking was affected disproportionately, much more heavily than conventional oil drilling?
Because of the environmental issues.
Yeah, that's one thing. That's one, but that's in more recent years. In 2007, 2008, that was still not a big public policy issue. Yeah, economy, but why the economic crash affected fracking much more than conventional oil drilling?
They don't make as much money, profits decrease.
Profits, why the fracking companies' profits decrease much more than conventional? Because the cost of fracking is a damn expensive technology. They can afford to sell the cost, it was like cut-off point $80, $90 15 years ago. The price needed to be $80 in order for you to be profitable as a fracking. And then when the price collapsed because of a weaker demand in the wake of economic crisis, the fracking business went down. Now it recovered later on. What happened? Fracking business recovered much more than people had expected in 2008, 2009.
Because the United States is trying to be more self-reliant.
Yeah, one thing was that, but that's just since 2016. Trump administration deregulated and we were a relatively sensible energy policy. That was one part. Okay. But another, even more, fracking business started recovering under the Obama administration. Obama was extremely hostile. Obama administration was extremely hostile to energy production. And yet fracking recovered, even in those circumstances. Yeah, go ahead.
Because the profits allowed for fracking, because the fracking costs were now in the market.
Actually, they improved technology. They cut the cost of fracking. The technology of fracking improved so much that now you could afford to sell at $50 and be in green and more the profit. So the cost, technological improvement of fracking technology was so dramatic that eventually they reduced their costs so much so that they can now afford to sell it at much cheaper prices. And that increased their profits. They became much more competitive vis-a-vis convention. And that's one thing that undermined. That's why, for example, Vladimir Putin doesn't like fracking a lot. Some environmental groups in America were kind of supported directly or indirectly by Russia, which is because Russians do not have fracking. That's a highly sophisticated technology. They don't know how to use it. Standard Oil, ExxonMobil actually worked with the Russians, and ever since the sanctions were imposed on Russia, they have just a conventional oil. The Saudis are the same. So all these OPEC countries, traditional oil producing countries, they're heavily hit by the American boom in fracking business. Because this supply of oil that wouldn't have been available otherwise is now available, and it reduces the price of oil. And it undermines their monopolistic position in the world market. And everything is caused by this technological breakthrough in fracking technology, coupled with the more reasonable environmental regulations by the Trump administration. And then you have America for the first time in its history is now, I think last year was the net energy export. Because America doesn't depend anymore on Middle Eastern oil. America produces enough oil and gas for its own consumption. And it exports gas in Eastern Europe. Okay, so we are already almost out of time. Any final questions? Okay, so you didn't do too well on the first quiz. So what I'm going to do is probably, I usually every year, if there is a situation like this, I disregard the worst performing quiz. So those of you who did well, it's okay. But for those of you who did really poorly on the first quiz, when the final calculation is made, your average for the homework assignments, I will disregard the quiz in which you performed the worst. So make sure that you prepare better for the second one, those of you who did do well in the first one. And then if anyone has some concerns or problems and so on, please come and see me in the meantime during the office hours. 11 o'clock every day. And that's all. Let's see you then on Tuesday.